Welcome everyone to what can sometimes feel like the mystery of bidding and tendering in the public sector. I'm hoping to demystify some of it for you in the next hour or so. So this is the third webinar we're running under the Supply Wandsworth Business Support Program. If you've been here before on the last two webinars, you'll know the form and the procedure, but I'll just run through it briefly. It's an interactive session. That's the key thing. I will be doing a reasonable amount of talking, but like anything, I think the more you put into life, the more you get out. So do get involved in the exercises. If you have any questions as we go through, pop them in the chat. I'll either answer them as we go through. Alternatively, we'll have a few minutes at the end to cover anything that you want to ask. So, okay, so let's get started. So I'm sorry if you've heard this, you're hearing this for the third time, but for those of you who haven't been here, just a little bit about my background. I've got a background in banking for my sins, 30 years with Lloyds, managing a variety of businesses from startups right through to international banks and large corporates. So I've seen the whole spectrum. My bidding and tendering knowledge and experience comes from 4 years of heading up the government team at Lloyds, where I was responsible for managing renewal and new tenders for both local authorities and central government departments. So that's where my background in tendering and bidding comes in. I'm a member of a business support organisation called Brandewin. We're running this programme on behalf of Wandsworth. And as you can see from the third bullet, I've been involved in quite a few of the programmes that we've been involved with and delivered. We deliver programmes like this on behalf of councils and chambers of commerce, and I've run hundreds of one-to-one sessions across the last few years. Been an advisor at the British Library, and I've also got a small social care business that I run, which is good for my heart, and this hopefully keeps my brain ticking over. So that's my 40 years of experience summarised in a minute, so time is obviously flying. So we've got a pretty full agenda this morning. We've got a fair bit to cover, and I know in this world of webinars and online technologies, there's a temptation to do lots of stuff in the background and check your emails. If you can, I'd encourage you to try and stay focused, because there's quite a lot of detail in the presentation this morning. So you'll get more out of it if you can stay focused on what we're talking about, but obviously that's your choice. So we'll run through the terminology, because it can be quite confusing sometimes in terms of what you're looking at. We're going to go through what's in a typical public sector tender document, and then go through a live example of a tender that Brandewin bid for and won with one of the councils. I'll spend some time looking at evaluation methodology and meat, nothing to do with T-bone steaks. I'll talk to you more about what that actually means in a moment. And then we'll look at the timelines for tenders within the public sector, which can be quite different to the private sector. Then what we'll do is we'll look at tendering in terms of your business model from the perspective of getting jobs done. And what I mean by that briefly is, what do the local authority need to get done by way of jobs? Then I'm going to spend a few moments on some areas that are getting much more profile and importance, particularly in public sector bidding and tendering. That's ESG and H, as it's called, and also social value, which I'm sure you've heard of. And I'll spend some time also looking at bidding via consortium and partnerships, tell you a bit about the Meet the Buyer event that we're running in mid-November at Tooting Works. So quite a bit to get through. So let's crack on. But just a little bit about the programme briefly. It's obviously a bidding and tendering support programme. As part of the programme, when you're dealing with public sector authorities, you will invariably be dealing with a procurement department. So you won't necessarily be dealing with the end user of the service. So we'll show you how to engage with procurement departments, what they look for, how to build relationships, and how the process works. Those of you who have been here before, you'll know there's an online bid capability assessment questionnaire. I'd encourage you to complete that if you can. It takes a few minutes, and it allows us to produce a report detailing your state of readiness to bid and tender and where the gaps are, so where you need to focus to get perhaps your tenders up to that point where you can win more tenders. Clearly, we're going to help you improve your bidding skills. I've said this a couple of times, but some SMEs treat the process as an administrative process, but it's clearly got some admin as part of the process, but it's a sales process. You're always selling yourself, your service, your product, your company. So we'll tell you a little bit about how that all works and how to sell yourself better in terms of things like your value proposition, developing relationships, that sort of thing. And then as part of phase 2 of the project, which is coming next year, we'll have hopefully what are called these one-to-one tender advice sessions where you can speak to specialists in more detail about your business and obviously what you need to do to win more tendering contracts with the council. And as I said, I'll talk to you also about the Meet the Buyer event that we're running in November. So that's a quick and dirty. This program's quite condensed, but there's lots of good stuff for you to get your teeth into, and we just need your time. So let's start by looking at some of the differences between public sector and private sector bidding and tendering. I mean, overall, a tendering process is similar, but there are some key differences. So I just want to run through those briefly. So firstly, with the public sector, they will have allocated budgets annually. So they'll have a certain amount of spend. Each department will have a certain amount of spend. And that's why sometimes, and I'm quite an honest guy, so forgive me for saying this, you'll find that when it's coming up to the end of their financial year, which is typically the end of March, and if they've got budget left over, all of a sudden there may be a rush to get certain things done. So they need to basically work within and use their annual budgets, whereas the private sector, very much more driven by requirements within their business, within their sector. Public sector, again, much more heavily restricted by legislation, process, whereas the private sector, much more free-form, lower restrictions. Public sector bidding process can cause concern or confusion because there's a lot of structure involved. It's a clear specified process, but it's like anything. As long as you know what the rules are, then it's not that difficult. So I will give you that process today to make sure that you're clear as to what you're looking at and how to do it. Time periods within the public sector, within local government, typically very fixed. We'll run through a time period just to give you an idea of timings. Often does slip from the original timing, whereas the private sector very much more flexible in terms of their purchasing. Obviously, with the the public sector, there's, they have to be completely transparent, Freedom of Information Acts, that sort of thing. They're spending our money, they're spending taxpayers' money. So, their primary motivation is to spend money fairly, wisely. We can see what happens when it doesn't happen in places like Birmingham, where they're virtually bankrupt. Whereas in the private sector, they're looking very much more on shareholder value, return on investment, that sort of thing. Public sector, typically a number of stakeholders, anything from, as I said, the procurement departments, the key decision makers, the end users, perhaps some specialists, whereas in the private sector, you typically may be dealing with only one or two individuals in the tender process. And the focus around the public sector is typically reducing spend, improving processes and savings, whereas, as I said, on the private sector, it's all about shareholder value and increasing margins. And those little diagrams along the bottom, which will be very little to you, they're areas that are gaining greater importance and prominence in the public sector. So it's things like the circular economy, it's things about environmental benefits, social value, community wealth building. Some or all of those terms may well be familiar to you. And I'll talk more about those as we go through the session. So first of all, I wanted to start off by giving you some actual feedback that comes from all the one-to-ones that me, my team, my colleagues, we do with businesses just like yours in terms of the issues they face when they're trying to bid and tender with public sector organisations. So let's just run through some of those briefly. So I hear that, businesses say, we've got insufficient experience in the public sector. Well, as I've said on my previous webinars, they're all recorded. I'll give you the links at the end. All the information that you need to understand the bidding, the tendering process, or understand the public sector organisation you're dealing with is out there. And it's purely a case of spending a bit of time and effort to research it, to spend the time. I hear that, the industry is dominated by big companies that are locked out. Well, virtually every local authority now has a strategy, more so post-COVID, to undertake what's called build community wealth building. And what that is, in simple terms, it's basically trying to increase local supply chains and ensure that local people, local businesses benefit more from growth within the borough and contracts within the borough. So to an extent, you're pushing against an open door because strategically, all local authorities, including Wandsworth, want to use local businesses and local suppliers like yours. I hear that your business is not known to public sector buyers. Well, like anything, there's a way of doing that. There are events. We'll put you in touch with key people within the public sector. We had our launch event back in September. We had the head of procurement there. We had the head of the economic development department up there. You can start to get yourself known to these people. And in terms of reaching the right people, those events are very good as well, because often when you're trying to get in hold of key decision makers, key influencers, they're busy people. They don't answer your email. It's hard to get them on the phone. The secretary doesn't put you through, etc. But at these events, you can meet these key people and start to build your relationship. There may be practical considerations that stop you from tendering. Perhaps your turnover is too small, you're a new business. Well, I'll show you there's a way of getting around that. Start building up things like case studies, testimonials. Companies say, well, we haven't got any. Well, start building those into your process. Start sharing them with the local authority as you build your relationship. And the bidding and tendering process, as I always say, takes time. It's quite detailed, particularly when you're doing it for the first time. And so I hear that you haven't got time to plan properly or devote enough time. So I'll show you how to do it. Because if you're going to do it properly. And then the last point's about not really understanding what the tendering process is, how to write strong bids, what to put it into win bids. That's exactly what we're going to do this morning. So as it says, it talks about the biggest secrets of doing business with the government. But like I said earlier, they're not really secrets. It's more just a case of there's a process, there's a system, and I'll share as much of that detail as I can so it will help you overcome those challenges. So they're real issues that SMEs like you have told us are important to them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about terminology. Apologies in advance that this bit's a bit technical, and I don't mean that in terms of your intellectual. It's just there's a lot of detail, so I'll try and keep it as light as I can. But I think it's important to understand what documents you're looking at, because it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. Because you'll get a pack of information, and you need to know what that information is. So initially, you'll get typically what's called a pre-qualification questionnaire. And that's like a stage one questionnaire. And it will just ask you basic questions about your company, insurance, maybe similar contracts you've worked on. And it's a fairly simple yes-no type questionnaire. It'll ask you things about fraudulent activity, whether you paid your taxes. So that's the stage one questionnaire. And the most common one, I suppose, is the invitation to tender, the ITT. And like I said, we'll work through a live, real example in a few moments. And the temptation sometimes is almost to forget about the PQQ, perhaps, and just jump into the ITT. And that's where you start to, I guess, build out your tender in terms of quality and costings. It's where you sort of answer the job, answer technical questions about your ability to do the work in accordance with the scope of the project. RFP, that's the next one. It's quite similar to an ITT. It's again where cost and quality are assessed, but they're used often when the client either can't or doesn't want to define specifically the scope of the work up front. So it means as a potential supplier, you've got to be quite descriptive and clear in your proposal about what you think is needed. You've then got what's called a RFQ, a request for quotation, a lot like a tender, surprise, surprise, but typically smaller in size and scope, and often geared to clients where they're just looking to find out pricing information for a particular type of work or particular material, some equipment. You don't typically need detailed proposals in that section. Then you may have come across a term called framework agreements, and this is when a group of suppliers, one or more businesses, get together and tender for business with a particular organisation. So you enter into a framework and the suppliers are contractually bound to tender for those various bits of business that the council might put out. And then finally, you have what's called a dynamic purchasing system, similar to framework agreements, although different in two ways. First of all, new suppliers can join at any time. And secondly, it's run as a completely electronic process. And the DPS, the dynamic purchasing system, is used exclusively in the public sector. So I said it's a bit technical, a bit dry, that section. Apologies for that. But I think it's important that you know what you're looking at, because it can often be a little bit confusing as to what it is you're actually being asked for when you get a big, thick pack of information in the initial tender proposal pack. So this is the sort of information you will find typically in a tender, and particularly in a public sector tender. So initially, there'll be an introduction. It will give you some information about the organisation, a bit about the tender, the timelines, why they're doing what they're doing, what they hope to achieve, that sort of thing. And then there'll be the tender conditions, all the legal stuff around the tender. And then there'll be the spec, the specific description of supplies or works that they want you to provide. There'll be particular instructions in terms of how to submit, the timelines, what format, by when, whether it's electronically, it's in a particular template. And then, of course, you'll have your qualitative tender response. And these are the detailed questions that you need to answer as part of the response. And we'll go through, as I said, one in a moment. There'll obviously be a pricing and delivery schedule. I've said previously, it's not a case of cheapest price wins. Typically, it's about the right price. And then there'll be what's called a form of tender. That's a declaration that all potential suppliers have to sign to say they confirm and agree with the terms and conditions. There may be a certificate of non-collusion, just confirming that you've produced your bid independently. And finally, there may be a draft contract which will be signed by the successful bidder in due course. So when you get that pack of information, just take yourself off into a quiet room and just make sure you go through it in detail and just highlight the key things, particularly in terms of timescales. And I talk a lot more about that in the previous tender webinars I've done, if you need to look at those at any stage. So, as I said, let's have a look at an actual tender that Branduin submitted and was successful winning. And when public sector authorities are putting out this information, they're looking at two key areas. They're looking to assess, first of all, your suitability as a potential supplier, because they're a public sector organisation, they've got reputational issues, so they're looking at your suitability, and then they're looking at your ability to deliver what it is they want. And that's where what are called method statements come in, which can sometimes be a bit daunting, but again, we're going to go through that. So let's look at suitability to start with. So first of all, there'll be some questions which you need to answer yes or no, and they're what are called mandatory exclusion sections. And there'll be questions around fraud, crime, money laundering, whether you've got barred directors, whether there's been any director misconduct. And quite simply, if you answer yes to any of those questions, you will be excluded from the process and the council will reject you. Then you've got an area which is slightly softer. So you've got areas which are what are called discretionary exclusion clauses. That might be something like, for example, a director who's had a CCJ, a county court judgment, but it's been repaid. And in that situation, it'll be at the discretion of the authority to decide whether to keep you in the process or perhaps to ask for a bit more information. They'll then ask you about your financial position. There'll be a variety of what I call standard questions, but they may have a minimum turnover requirement because they might want to only deal with companies of a certain size. I'll tell you how you get around that. If you're a smaller organization, it doesn't mean you'll definitely be rejected, but if, for example, they're saying they need companies of a turnover of a minimum of 100,000 and your turnover is 10,000, probably not going to be included as part of the process. But there's a way around there. They'll ask some high-level financial details like your turnover, what's your financial year end, that sort of thing. Who are your bankers? Do you have an accountant for your organization? They may also, if you're slightly larger, run a credit check on your organization. They're independently done by credit reference agencies. And if it's a low, medium, high risk rating. And if you come into the high or medium risk rating, they may exclude you. They may ask for some additional information. So these are all part of the assessment they're going through to help them understand, are you a suitable supplier for the council? You'll invariably need certain levels of insurance, and the most typical ones, which I'm sure you're familiar with, are employer's liability, public liability, and professional indemnity insurance. And they'll specify a particular level that is required. You may either already hold it, or alternatively, you can tick a box to say you're willing to get that level of insurance if you're successful. And you will not be disadvantaged, you will not be scored less in any shape or form if you haven't got it, but you agree that you will get it if you're successful. So that's not an issue. And then finally, there may be some additional suitability questions they'll ask, which are not necessarily just all the things we've talked about, like financial insurance. It might be things around your expertise, capacity concerns. Do you have the ability to actually deliver the contract? Are there particular risks that you haven't mentioned? And again, they ask you to be upfront about those. And that all helps them assess your suitability. Okay, give me 2 seconds. I'm very conscious there's a lot of info here, so if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat, and it'll break up me talking to you, and also happy to obviously answer as we go through, as well as at the end. So let's look at method statements. They can often cause suppliers concern, if that's the right word. They're not sure what to put in a method statement. So this was a contract that Brand New In bid for to run business support services like this in some shape or form. So first of all, you'll see down the right, there's a weighting column. And that basically shows you how much importance, how much of the scoring and the evaluation scores are allocated to that section. So clearly, if it's a higher percentage, like the service delivery section in this one, which is 25%, you need to make sure you complete that section fully and clearly with evidence and all those good things. So it says, they'll ask us to deliver how we're going to meet the council's requirements, what training we would have provided, how we're going to mitigate any risks or challenges. I was talking to a colleague just earlier, a friend, and we ran a session. This is about business continuity, which obviously they'll ask you about as well. We ran a session where we had 40 people on a call. It was a launch event for another event about 2 years ago, and literally Zoom went down. And then basically, we basically were going to do a, no, sorry, my apologies. We were going to do a face-to-face event, and we had a train strike, and then we put it on Zoom. So you've got to have some contingency plans in place, is what I'm saying. They'll ask you about your mobilization plan. What I mean by that is, how are you going to undertake the various tasks to allow you to meet the specification? And how are you going to articulate that? Do you have a project plan? Do you have a spreadsheet that shows what needs to be done by when, and who's going to do it, and who's accountable? So they'll ask you to produce what's called a mobilization plan. They'll clearly want to know a bit more about your management structure. What's the experience, the qualifications, the competence of these people? Who are the key personnel that are going to be working on the contract? And yes, the business continuity arrangements comes in there. Sorry, I jumped the gun too soon on that. But that, as you said, was an example of making sure you've got backup in place for when things sometimes, do go wrong, which are outside of our control. They'll also ask for what relevant experience your organization has got in delivering similar services. So those of you who came to the launch event, which we had in September at Tooting Works, you'll have heard, I think, Mark Glaister, the head of procurement and buying, stand up and say that very thing that they always ask. What experience have you got of delivering similar contracts? Whether it's online or whether it's face-to-face, what sort of training did you have in place? What organizations have you worked with in the last few years? What were the value of the contracts? What were the services you provided? So they'll ask for detail to allow them to assess, do you have the right experience to do this sort of thing? Have you got a track record in terms of providing these sort of services? So of course, if you have, it's going to put you in a much stronger position. In this contract, they were keen for us to basically get as many diverse and different types of SMEs to get involved with the business support program. So they wanted to know how we would engage them, how we'd work with business communities who were, perhaps facing uncertainty, economic decline, and they'll ask you for outcomes, including what the contract values were and how you achieve those outcomes. So lots and lots of information. And I talk in a lot more detail about how you do that and what to put in those sections in my other webinars that I've done. In this one, they wanted to talk about, how we would engage Black and minority ethnic SME companies, for example, excluded communities. Have we done that on other contracts? So again, all these things start to build up your overall tender response, a combination of suitability and, secondly, your technical expertise. And then finally, we were asked about the London living wage. And this is all about, obviously, paying people the right rate, or paying people a living wage, as it says. It's becoming much more important. Of course, it's a difficult world out there. And with Wandsworth, they're particularly keen on health and well-being. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. And if you are paying the living wage or you aren't paying it, for example, they're saying, would you pay them for this contract only? So they want to know that you're looking after your people. So there's a lot of information that you need to collate succinctly to build up your method statement. So I hope that gives you an idea of the sort of things that are typically required in a method statement. And don't forget those weighting columns, as you said, down the right. So you make sure you put the most important things and the right level of information in the areas which have the highest weighting. Right, okay, so let's move on to meat. As I said, very poor jokes, nothing to do with steaks, but basically it stands for most economically advantageous tender. And basically what you have is you'll have your tender and there'll be evaluators as part of the procurement department who'll be scoring and evaluating the tender responses based on a combination of price and quality. And depending on what the contract is, there'll be a higher weighting, perhaps maybe 50-50 based on price and quality. So in the first bullet point, you can see they're saying that 75% of the weighting of the scoring will be based on price and only 25% on quality. That's obviously where they're looking for a low price, quite simply. So it might be a commodity service, it might be a simple cleaning contract where they think, most cleaning companies can do what they need, they just want lowest price. The contrary to that, the opposite, of course, is the type of contracts that we as brand unit are working on. So invariably, there's a much higher focus on quality, and they don't mind paying a bit more as long as the quality is high. And what the evaluators will do is they'll produce like a matrix, they'll produce like an evaluation criteria based on this weighted sort of numbers, and they'll rank them. They'll rank them in terms of scorings. And you can see down on the right, there are a variety of different areas that they consider when they're looking at assessing the tender bid responses. So, of course, quality and pricing, as I said, they want to know about your technical ability, how experienced are your team, things like, and we'll touch upon it in a few moments, social value, what are you adding to the community, what are the environmental benefits, do you have an innovative mindset, are you good problem solvers, can you come up with new ideas, can you demonstrate added value? And what's your after-sales service? Can you actually deliver on time? So have you got a proven methodology, as I said earlier, to show that you can do what you're being asked to do in terms of the project spec? So the one other thing I wanted to just briefly touch upon on this slide is that local authorities are trying to move away from just assessing tender responses on price. So there's a move to take out the word economically. So it's going to move next year, we believe, to most advantageous tender. And that basically helps the local authority or forces the local authorities to focus on broader supplier value beyond price. So just keep that in your mind. It's not to say that obviously price is a factor, but they're trying as a strategy, as a big picture outcome, to move away from just low cost and think, what are the broader benefits of working with these suppliers? What do they bring over and above a good price? So keep that in your mind as well. So let's look a little bit about the evaluation process. This is just an example of how they may score you. And like I said earlier, you'll invariably have a procurement department with a group of evaluators. It's not necessarily their full-time job, but they'll be evaluating the tender responses on behalf of the end service users. And their job is to score your responses against the questions and the key criteria. So as you can see, in every situation, of course, you're looking to try and score as highly as possible. So you're looking to exceed the requirements that they've put as a base level standard, things like making sure you've answered the question fully, precisely, responsibly, with relevance. You've provided evidence to back up what you say. You may have come up with some additional added value services, some innovative ideas that they haven't thought about, and all those things help you score more highly and stand out from your competition. Sets you above all the rest, because that's what you're always trying to do. You're trying to make sure you make the next cut to get down to the final presentation stage. And of course, as you go down the scale, as you can see at the bottom, if you answer poorly, you're going to score poorly. The example I'll give you very briefly there is I was at a presentation for Luton Airport, I think a year or so ago, and very briefly, they had a tender response for some services they required, There was a very large company who they knew were good and could do what they wanted, but that company decided that because they were so big, they didn't have to answer all these basic questions, and so they didn't answer all the questions fully. And guess what? They were rejected and did not get the contract because no matter what your size, you still have to go through the required process and answer everything fully, evidence everything fully, because it's a very precise, objective process. Even if the guy who's the procurement director knows the person from his company, knows they do a fantastic job, if it can't be proven and evidence and stand up to scrutiny, external scrutiny, then you won't win the contract. So put everything into your bid and tender responses. So let's just look at a timetable. This is, again, a live example from a tender that we looked at. And so you can see the first stage is, the tender is published, know where that is. It could be sent electronically. It could be on one of the various portals. I'll show you about that at the end. Then maybe they might want to do some site visits. There's always time made for clarifying any questions that potential suppliers may have. There'll then be a submission deadline. Stuff down the right that I've written, read the stuff carefully, know your deadlines, be crystal clear. Don't leave it to the last minute. Don't leave it to the last day. A lot of these tenders are now submitted electronically, and the number of local authorities I've spoken to who might have a deadline of, I don't know, midday on Friday, and they're getting calls by people at 10 to 12 saying, I can't quite log into the system, it's not uploading properly. Always work to 1 day in advance of your deadline. So plan well in advance and mobilize whoever you need to help you and support you as quickly as you can. Going back to the timeline, there'll be then a period of evaluation for the evaluators, for the procurement department and the service users. They'll then narrow it down to a shortlist. They'll make an announcement of, for example, 3 or 4 potential suppliers who've made the shortlist, and they'll be then asked to come in and present their case. Then finally, there'll be a notice of award and there'll be a contract start date. And that's actually the timetable set out in a live tender, but in reality, these things often slip for a variety of reasons. So don't worry sometimes if you put in a tender submission and you haven't heard. It's just because it may have slipped for, as I said, a variety of internal or external factors. So it's a very prescribed, specific timeline with specific goals, milestones, and deadlines. So make sure you know what they are. Okay, so let's just spend a minute or so on this slide, and then I'm going to stop talking because I've been talking far too much and ask you to do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of work. So I said at the outset, one of the things you need to try and focus on to get in the mindset of the local authorities, what they want. It sounds a statement of the obvious, but it's not about what you want to sell. It's about what the buyer wants. So if you can get into their thought process and understand what is it they're trying to achieve, basically, and the way I'm breaking it down there is to say, what jobs do they need to get done to solve their problem? So whenever you're doing this, sell value, sell benefits, don't talk about features, and try and understand what's the job they need to get done to get the problem, the issue, the outcome sorted out. Right, so time for you to do a bit of thinking and a little bit of work. Like I said earlier, do get stuck in, do put some stuff in the chat. What I want you to have a little think about here is briefly, and you can put stuff in the chat or you can write stuff down on paper or your laptops or whatever you're doing, is write down what it is you actually do, high level, and then try and explain how it meets desired outcome for the local authority. How does it help them achieve what they want? Think about, like I said, what problem they're trying to solve, what job do they need to get done. So let me give you a brief example before I let you think about it a bit. They may have a desire, for example, to increase the percentage of Black and minority ethnic employees. So that would be a high-level strategic outcome. But the job to be done would be something like they need to improve, change, or remodel their recruitment process or their recruitment forms. That's the job they need to get done. So the high-level outcome, increase the number of Black and Asian minority ethnic employees. The job is improving or remodeling their recruitment process. So I'm going to give you a minute or two. I know it's not a lot of time, but like I said, have a think about that for a moment. If you can, put some stuff in the chat. Just a simple example of what you do, how it would solve a job, how it would solve a problem for the local authority. And think also, say, big picture outcomes, and also what need are they trying to satisfy. I'm going to rest my voice for a minute. You have a think, pop something in the chat if you can. Additionally, pop any questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer. And if it's something that isn't clear, do that as well, and I'll help you out. So I know it's always who's going to go first, but I'll give you a moment to think. Whilst this way of thinking might be a little bit different from you, it's important for you to adapt your offer, your process to fit in to the way the local authority work or what they want to achieve, because they won't adapt. They'll expect you to modify your processes, your system, your offer to adapt and fit in with them. We have our first comment. Thank you very much, whoever that is. Oh, hi, Ken. It's good to see you. Good to see you back. So, yes, so Ken has just said apprenticeship schemes. So, yeah. So basically, there may be, for example, I mean, you can elaborate a bit more on that, Ken, if you want. There may be, for example, a drive to help young people get into employment. And what they need help with in the council is running apprenticeship schemes. So I don't know if that's what you meant, Kenaz, but yeah, that's a good example. So Kenaz has been brave. He's jumped 2-footed into the chat. So you can all have a go at putting something in there now if you want. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so. But thanks, Kenaz, for getting us started. Okay, we got another one. That's great. Oh, good. It was what you meant. Yeah. So, yeah, adding social value. That's good. Yeah, because obviously helping young people. Yeah, that's great. Emily, I'm just going to have a read of yours because it's a bit longer. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for Emily. So Emily's basically saying she's there as a fundraiser from a charity perspective, but they do a lot of work with young refugees and help them with employment, that sort of thing. And that's great. That's absolutely a good way of demonstrating how you're adding social value. So the job to be done there might be helping to recruit more young people, more young refugees, and explain to them what the process is to get jobs within the council. That might be the job to be done. But yeah, good example. Okay, well, thank you both for your input on that. I know it's sort of a one to think about a little bit deeper, and perhaps do think about that after the session. But it's a different way of considering what needs to be done. So what I want to spend a few minutes on now is this ESG, and basically what we're doing here is we're moving away from not just what you do as a business, but how you do it. And that's getting much greater impact and importance in business, and particularly in the public sector when they're evaluating tenders. So I'm not going to read through every word on the slide because that's not the way I do stuff, but in terms of what I'm going to use acronyms. So ESG, it's a collective term for your impact as a business on the environment and on society. And it's about how transparent and how robust is your governance process. And it covers a number of things, as you can see. And I guess it measures what your impact is on these areas. And what I'm trying to say there is, from the perspective of your business models and how you run your business, start thinking about this, because it is definitely now more important in the public sector when they are reviewing and looking at tender responses, and when they're just looking at using suppliers generally. And there are certainly benefits to adopting these ESG frameworks. Here are some of the things you might want to consider. It's a quite detailed list. I won't go through it in massive detail, but I think with anything this may be new to you, or maybe something you're already familiar with. If it is new to you, what I would say or just think about what's your first step. So under the environmental section, you might think your first step is just to read up a little bit more about what this all means, and with the objective of producing a small, simple environmental social governance policy. And it could be something as simple as waste reduction. One thing that gets my back up massively, forgive me for digressing, is I order something from Amazon. It's this big, and it comes in packaging that is absolutely huge. Like, I mean huge. Not all the time, but often. So, there might be simple ways you can sort of reduce waste just by, reducing the size of your packaging. Just find ways of demonstrating that you're doing something to help the environment. And in terms of social responsibility, Emily talked earlier about helping, young refugees. What sort of employee benefits do you pay the living wage? Are you an equal opportunities employer? These things have always been important, but I think they've become more important and of greater importance post-COVID, because employees now are very conscious of health and well-being, and we'll talk a bit more about that as well. And the governance side is really all about your sort of risk management and your processes. So there are a number of things that you can consider and start to work towards, which will help you differentiate and show the council that you have plans, strategies, and you think about these things. You could do a whole webinar on this, and we have very little time. So there's a link at the bottom of the slide, which just is a very sort of useful and user-friendly ESG guide for small businesses. So have a look at that. And as I say, having an ESG policy framework does have some benefits. It improves your reputation. It may help you attract new customers, new employees. There are certainly, forgive me, I'm an old so-and-so, but younger people seem to be much more conscious and thoughtful about working for ethical companies. They want to work with companies who are doing some good for the environment. They want to work with companies who are reducing their carbon footprint, aware of greenhouse gas emissions, that sort of thing. So it can help you attract new employees. And it's all about, on the governance side, your decision-making process behind that. So let's also talk about health and well-being and why that's important, because it's certainly important in Wandsworth Council, because Wandsworth, they support employers to create healthy, engaged, and productive workplaces through a variety of their schemes. And you can see on the right that there are 3 schemes that I've just written down. I'm not sure if my picture's covering that. I'm going to attempt to move it. So yeah, you've got the Mayor's Good Work Standard, you've got Local Healthy Workplace Award, and the Healthy Catering Commitments. These are all accreditations that you as businesses can apply for and get. And by having that, you demonstrate to the council that you're taking health and well-being seriously, and you're doing your best to look after your employees. I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat because someone's put something in there, which is always good. You weren't able to click on the link, Carla. Okay, I think we'll send the slides around after. I'll put my details in the chat now. If for any reason you don't get the slides or you can't make the link work, just send me an email. So give me 1 second. Okay, I think the slides are going to be sent round, but if they're not, just send me an email and we can send out the link. That's not a problem at all. Thanks for raising that for me, Carla. That's great. So yeah, as I was saying, there are various different initiatives that the council have, and they want to be able to want you as businesses to be able to demonstrate that you're doing something to create healthy workspaces for your employees. And there are a number of benefits. These are what I call standard benefits, but they are benefits. Certainly we know a happy, motivated, satisfied workforce are more productive. It helps you improve your company image. I think there was a survey done last year, and essentially the top 3 benefits of a healthy workspace environment were healthier and more inclusive culture, yes, better work-life balance. I think that's definitely become more important post-COVID, because employees, they want a balance between working from home, for example, and going into the office. When I was working in the city, I used to commute, an hour each way every day. That was 2 hours of my life every day lost. So yeah, I would have loved it if I could have had the flexibility of working from home occasionally. So I think that's more important to people. And if employees feel valued, they feel looked after, they feel that the company really cares, they'll put more in. Things like reduced turnover, reduced absenteeism. And I'm sure you've all heard about Google's workspaces, and they have these sort of rooms where you can go and relax, you can go and play pool, and it's all about making employees feel wanted, cared for, and by doing that, it's quite simple. They'll work for you more productively. They'll work for you harder. So lots of good stuff that you can be doing as businesses. And again, by demonstrating that in your tender submissions, it will stand you above companies who haven't got those ESG and healthy workspace wellbeing policies in place. No problem, Carla. My pleasure. Okay, so just to finish off on the subject, there are a few sort of takeaways there. Again, bit of a busy slide there. Sorry about that. Just think about what sustainability means to you as an organization, and try and take that first step. I mean, think about the sort of companies or sort of clients that you're dealing with. What's important to them? What's important to your stakeholders in terms of ESG, in terms of health and well-being? And the final point is, take some action, allocate someone in your organization. If you're a one-man band, guess what? Or lady band, that's going to be you, unfortunately. But make it someone's individual responsibility to at least start thinking about this as an issue, because it's not going away, and B, it does genuinely do some good, and it's a different way of working. It's trying to be more socially and environmentally aware, and be also aware that people want to be looked after. Employees want a healthy living workspace. So quite a lot of information there, but things that will help you. Let's now move on to social value and building community wealth. You may have heard these terms, but in simple terms, like I mentioned at the outset, all councils, including Wandsworth, they have a strategy to build community wealth. And quite simply, what it means is they want local people, local businesses to benefit from the growth of the area, and they want to see evidence of how you as businesses will help build community wealth, help do something positive for the area, for the council, and whether that's sort of sustainable work practices. There's a few examples down the bottom there. The simplest example I heard from talking to someone, he was a painter and decorator. He was tendering for a contract. He won the contract with the council, and he said, well, I'll paint the local community centre. It hadn't been painted for 5 years. So it doesn't have to be something particularly complex and big. It's just be a way of showing the council, the way of showing the local authority that you're trying to do some good for the community. Whether it's promoting local jobs through apprentice schemes, whether it's environmental issues. I had a letter from a financial advisor company I deal with last week, and they said something along the lines of, we're going to plant 10 trees for every policy we sell or something. So again, these are just ways of trying to do the right thing. I'm not trying to be greater than thou or godly about that, but you know what I'm saying. It's trying to do the right thing for the planet, basically, in simple terms. So social value is an important area and is gaining greater importance with the council. For example, with contracts of a certain size, over 100,000, they have to have 10% of social value built into that contract. So with construction companies, if they're building a new block of flats, for example, 10% of it has to be social housing. And what the authorities are also doing is they're trying to now find more objective ways of measuring social value so that they can compare. So the further ahead of the curve you can get in terms of your thinking about how you're going to demonstrate social value or environmental social policy, the more you're likely to stand out from those who are just thinking, well, it's going to go away. It's a fad. It's not going to go away. And it's particularly important for the councils. So again, a couple of links there. So again, if they don't work, just let me know. I'll copy and paste them and send them to you guys. It's from the London Anchors Institutions Network, which if you haven't heard of, they're an organisation of larger companies, and their key objective and strategy is to give business to local companies, to local suppliers. So if you haven't heard of them, then maybe put that down as one of your actions. Oh, that's the one thing I didn't mention at the outset, is I will ask you to put down 1 or 2 things you're going to do as a result of spending an hour of your important time listening to me today. So I want you to get something tangible to do that's going to take you forward as part of the process. So maybe even just look up the London Anchors Institution, because they're a very interesting organisation. Okay, next exercise for you to have a think about. Looking at the time here, we've got 10 minutes, we're still on track. I just want you to have, I'm sure you've all done a SWOT analysis in your business generally, but what you want you to do is think of it and look at it from a tender perspective. So think about what are your strengths? How can you demonstrate added value in your tender response? Is it innovative thinking? Have you got some new ideas? How will you stand out from your competition? So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Again, pop anything you can in the chat. And be honest, if you've got weaknesses, don't be shy. You can put it down. What are the threats? What are the opportunities? All these exercises are designed to force you, that's the wrong word, encourage, that's a much better word, encourage you to think perhaps slightly differently to the way you've done before. And it's not easy. It's not something you can do at the drop of the hat. Just start giving that some thought. So I'll give you a minute to do that now. And if not, hopefully you'll put something in the chat for me as you have done before. But if not, you can certainly look at that after the session. It's a useful exercise to go through. We're curious about looking at what are the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and the threats of my tender response. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. I do appreciate that some of these things take a bit more thought. So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but if you can put just a few thoughts down in the chat. What's the strength of your organization, your company, when you're bidding and tendering? What would stand you head and shoulders above the rest? What would allow the evaluators to score you highly? That's the sort of thought process. Weaknesses might be, I don't know, you might not have any case studies, for example, or you might not have any testimonials. Kenez, you're a star. You always get the ball rolling. Thank you for that. Yeah, so you're saying you're a BAME company. That's good. And you've got policies in place. That's also good. Yeah, yeah. You'd be surprised, or maybe you won't be surprised, how many small businesses don't have any policies in place. They probably have them in their head, but they don't have them written down. They don't have to be 20-page documents. They can be like 1 pages, 2 pages. So yeah, good examples. That's definitely a strength, Kenez, in terms of your company. You've got Black, Asian, minority, ethnic employees, I'm guessing, and you've got some policies in place around that. So I'll just give it 30 seconds for anyone else who wants to pop something in, because I'm conscious that time is pressing. I like to try and finish on time. Okay, I'll keep moving. But thanks for think about it after the session, because it's a useful exercise to go through in your own minds. So here's something for you to think about. First of all, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And this is all about consortiums and working together. I'm the sort of person that I think I can do it much better myself. I'll just get it done quickly. I don't really need much help. If I can focus, get me to do it, I'll get it done quicker. That doesn't necessarily produce the best outcome. So over my career, I've worked out that actually working as a team, bringing people in who've got more experience than me, that's much more potentially positive in terms of the final outcome. So let's just spend a minute or so on consortium and partnership bidding. Because quite simply, you may find with tenders sometimes that you look at a tender bid and you think, well, I can do 60, 70% of that, but I can't do that other 30%. So the whole point is you can come together with another organization and together produce a stronger winning bid. We talked earlier about smaller turnover companies with a turnover threshold. We talked about potentially new companies don't have a track record. That's one way of getting yourself into the larger organizations like councils, and that's by joining forces with another company. So the definition, very briefly, as it says, 2 or more organizations who can't individually meet all the requirements of the tender, and they take the view that if they come together, they can put together, hopefully, a winning bid. Some rules and sort of a process around consortium bidding. The local authority, they'll only contract with one legal entity. So someone in that consortium would have to act as the lead member to submit the bid, and the authority will only contract with the lead bidder, and they will only pay the lead bidder. So just worth remembering, there are various structures you can put in place. You can have what's called an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, limited liability partnerships, that sort of thing. And the sort of things to think about if you are looking at putting a consortium bid together is what are the legal arrangements, who's going to make the decisions, what's the governance and the financing around it, what are the exit arrangements for consortium partners, are there penalties if people leave? So it's a formalized process, but it's a way of strengthening your bid if perhaps, like I say, you're too small or you can only meet certain criteria within a bid. But always remember, if you are putting together a consortium bid, it still has to read as one document. If you've got 4 or 5 people putting together a bid, it still has to read, excuse me, as if it's been written by one person. And you can get external bid specialists to look at that for you and help you with that process, although you still have to own the overall bid yourself. So just worth thinking about, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a webinar we're running next week on that subject. One of the other things I often hear in talking to local, small businesses and local authorities is that basically, well, they always use the existing supplier. They never change. Once you're in with the local authority, they're always going to just renew the contract with the existing supplier. Not true, strictly speaking. If you are an incumbent supplier, if you are an existing supplier, if you've done a good job, you should be in a stronger position than a new supplier. And again, talk more about that in my previous webinars. But if you're trying to displace an existing, get an existing supplier out, there are certain things you can do. It's all around research. It's about understanding the length of the contract, how big it is, what services they provide. Make sure you start building a relationship. You're not going to just meet the local authority once, twice, 3 times, and then give you business. It's a long-term relationship. Certainly in my banking days, we spent, months getting to know people. And then when the tender came up in due course, you had a relationship. So think about what's coming up for renewal. There's information about that from the council that's available. Tailor your USP to what they want. One other way, of course, of trying to get in through the door is to price initial bids very competitively. So we used to do that, undercut the market, for example, to start with, to get in. So you may offer a discount in year 1, for example, if it's a 3-year contract. And the final point is, you don't necessarily have to do the displacing yourself. Like I said, you can partner up with a larger organization, perhaps even existing suppliers, and then get into the authority that way. So there are ways of getting into the local authorities and displacing people who are already running those contracts. And there's a contract register, which I mentioned in my previous webinar, which you can all see. So just a few tips to get you started and a few actions. Start with a particular sector, a subsector, and, define your value proposition. If you don't know what it is, then Google it. We haven't got time to talk about that now. Focus your effort where it matters. It takes time. So where can you get your maximum return on investment? Think big and start small. So, don't go for £100,000 contracts initially because they're going to be more involved. Maybe think of have the process to be able to do that. Start with smaller contracts. Look out for tender alerts, networking opportunities. Go to these advanced notification sessions, so these meet the buyer events, pre-market engagement events, those sort of things, and think about how you can adapt your process. How can you differentiate? We've talked about social value and community wealth building as examples. And the final point is, don't think about just can you do it, but can you actually win it? Because that's key. If you're going to put all this time and effort in, you want to give yourself the best possible chance to win. Right, so time is pressing, so let's crack on. So just to summarize, and this is a summary of a little bit about what we talked about and also from my previous 2 webinars. So when you're looking at your tender response, make sure you've satisfied all the criteria, you've answered the questions clearly, you've read the instructions properly, you've answered that question, why you, what differentiates you from the competition, why do you stand out? You focused on the customer, it's about them, you explained the benefits, the value you add, you priced it correctly, you've got a well-written, professional and succinct tender response. Don't just put as much information as you can. It helps make the evaluation process easier, and you've provided evidence to back them up. If you do all those things, you're going to be well on the way to a winning bid. Just a brief comment on where to find these opportunities if you're not too sure. As you can see, a high percentage of contracts were available through the tender process, nearly 90%. And like it says, a number of on that second bullet point on the dash, forgive me, it says, if you're part of these framework agreements and the contract's below a certain size, the commissioning officer can select suppliers to invite to bid. So get yourself on framework agreements. Get your relationship started with key people within the council. And they use Delta Resourcing is their main portal for advertising contracts. So if you're not on that, get yourself registered. And there's lots of information on the website. Again, the links are there in terms of what the council look for and how they advertise contracts and the sort of things that help you win contracts. Quick summary of the programme. We've had the launch, as you know, and I've talked about the bidding capability questionnaire. 2 webinars I've run over the last 2 weeks. Very useful, in my humble opinion, and also from the people who attended. They're recorded. I'll give you again the recording links after. And we'll be running one, well, actually, my colleague will be running one next week. And that's all about some of the things we've touched upon here. That's the circular economy. It's all about, waste management, tackling global challenges, sustainability, recycling, those sort of things, and also developing key partnerships for consortium bidding. So very worthwhile getting yourself on there. And the link for that is at the bottom. And then there are a couple of events that Wandsworth Council are also running in terms of well-being. They're on the right. They've got Zoom links up there as well. So again, get yourself on those if you can, and you want to sort of start promoting, more healthy and well-being environment for your team or for your business. That's the questionnaire I've talked about. I'm rushing through these last ones. I want to give you a few minutes for a bit of feedback, and also to complete a little bit of an action plan if you can. They're the links for the webinars. They're on our YouTube channel. This one will be uploaded in the next few days, and the last 2 have also been put on there. So, if you want to go back and review what we've talked about, then there's plenty of time to do that at your leisure. And that might be your action, something to do. The Meet the Buyer event, we're running that on the 14th of November. And they are good events. You have key people there from both the council. You also have key people from the local private sector, decision makers, the sort of people that it's hard to get hold of. So do get yourself registered to come along to that. It's an in-person, face-to-face event. Good to see people in person. It's at Tooting Works. I'm sure you know where that is. And we hope to see as many of you there as possible. Just a bit about how to get on the program. Skills webinars, links are on Eventbrite. If you want to participate in the Meet the Buyer events, then Gregory's your man at Wandsworth. I'm sure you know Gregory. There's his details on the screen. And what we do as part of this process, hopefully, is help you get to a point of submitting expressions of interest to the council and developing winning bids. So I did say at the start, I'm sorry, there's quite a lot of information in this webinar. That's why I wanted you to try and concentrate. And I want to just give you a few minutes now to basically just pop something in the chat. There are 3 points there. Just put one thing down, one thing that you're going to do as a result of spending an hour of your precious time listening to me. And also, if you have any feedback, positive or negative, I'd also welcome that in the chat. If you have any questions, I'm going to stay online for a few minutes. And it just leaves me to say thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me this morning. We're a couple of minutes over. We started a couple of minutes late. So I'll just keep the chat open for a few minutes and say one action, if you would, and any feedback would be much appreciated. Okay, Emily, yeah, so you're going to focus on specific sectors. Yeah, it's good. So defining what your actual ideal target clients look like, that's always good, rather than just trying to target everyone. Good. Yeah, Canaz, that's a good one. Complete some policies. There's plenty of stuff online. Like I said, you don't have to have 10, 20-page documents. You can have a social value policy, and it could be 1 page. The point is you have something you can demonstrate you're thinking about, and it also shows you that you're. Oh, good, Roddy. I'm glad you you downloaded the social value guide. So that link must have worked for you. So good. So if the links don't work for anyone, give me a shout, drop me an email. But Roddy seems to have managed to do it. So it sounds like some of the links work. So that's good. You went to the website. Okay. Okay. I'll check if the slides are going around. If not, just drop me a line and I'll put all the links on an email and send them out to you. No problem at all. Anyone else for any actions or feedback, good, bad, or indifferent? Like I say, if you have any questions after the session, you've got my email details. I'll be happy to have a chat. And then hopefully when the phase 2 of the project kicks off next year, we'll be able to have these one-to-one sessions where we can go into your own business in much more detail. Right, so a couple more minutes for last minute actions or last minute feedback. As I say, feedback's always helpful. As I say, I try and keep these things as lively as possible. It's sometimes difficult when the subject is quite detailed, but hopefully it's given you an insight into, like I said, the public sector bidding and tendering process, and the fact that actually, if you plan it properly, you know the rules and you know the steps, it's not that difficult, but it does take a bit of time and effort. I grant that is the case. Oh, good. I'm glad you think the tender SWOT is a useful exercise. Yeah, because it is. It does really sort of help you to focus on where your strengths are in terms of your bid, your tender. And also what will help you in that is if you manage to complete that bid questionnaire that I was talking about, it'll also show you what the gaps are. So for example, if you've got no policies, it will say maybe get some policies in place for whether it's social value, anti-slavery, business continuity. So yeah, thanks for the feedback, Roddy. Appreciate it. Right. Okay. Well, I think everyone's fairly quiet, so I'm guessing you're thinking about it, but you haven't put it in the chat. Well, that's what I'm hoping anyway. Thank you very much for taking the time out. As I say, my colleague Tony Mulvihill will be here same time next week. Do join him. I'll be on the call as well. Um, oh, good, Heidi. I'm glad you found it useful. Yeah, that's my role. To try and help you sort of and equip you to complete and bid for tenders because it is, as I said, a fairly detailed process. But once you understand the steps, it becomes a little bit easier. So yeah, you're welcome, Kenneth. Thanks for attending all the sessions. I know you've been, I think, on every one. So I hope you found them useful as well. So good. Okay. Well, listen, this leaves me to say thank you again. Have a great day, everyone. Any questions? You've got my details in the chat. Happy to answer any questions outside of this session. And good luck with your bidding and tendering. And we'll look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks a lot. All the best. Bye bye.